The peaceful stillness of a city park is shattered when a routine evening for a mother and daughter turns into a battleground of dignity and injustice. Elaine Harper, a determined single mother, is confronted by Officer Darren Crowley, a man driven by prejudice and emboldened by his unchecked authority. What starts as a simple family moment spirals into a shocking act of abuse that leaves Elaine humiliated, but not defeated. In front of her terrified daughter, Elaine faces a choice: succumb to fear or rise against the injustice staring her down. The tension crackles as a crowd gathers, phones raised, recording every moment. The question lingers: will Elaine's courage be enough to take on a man who believes himself untouchable? Before we dive into this gripping story of resilience, bravery, and justice, comment below where you're watching from today. If you find this story powerful and meaningful, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss more incredible tales like this one. The city park buzzed softly in the early evening, the sky awash with hues of purple and navy as dusk painted its quiet masterpiece. Children's laughter drifted from the nearby playground, mingling with the rhythmic hum of families strolling beneath glowing street lamps. Amid this tranquil setting, Elaine Harper stood tall, her posture both graceful and resolute. She was a striking black woman in her early 40s, with a commanding presence shaped by years of challenges that had carved resilience into her very being. Beside her, 10-year-old Lena beamed with enthusiasm, her bright eyes sparkling with adoration for her mother. Tonight was their sacred time, a rare reprieve from the daily grind and an opportunity to connect. Elaine had promised to teach Lena the basics of skateboarding, a skill Elaine herself had mastered growing up on rugged city streets. Those days of skating had given her more than balance. They'd armed her with confidence and determination, traits she now wanted Lena to embrace. As Lena positioned her small foot on the skateboard, her legs wobbled precariously. Elaine chuckled softly, her voice warm yet steady. "Keep your knees bent, sweetheart," she coached. "If you feel like you're losing your balance, just let yourself fall naturally. I've got you." Lena looked up at her mother, her trust evident in the wide grin she flashed. For the young girl, learning to skateboard wasn't just about mastering a hobby. It was about mirroring her mother's courage and poise. Each stumble, each attempt at finding her footing, was a step closer to embodying the strength she saw in Elaine. Elaine, ever vigilant despite the joy of the moment, scanned the park with a subconscious alertness that came naturally to her. Her life had been marked by obstacles and hard-fought victories. She had grown up in a tough neighborhood where survival required both physical and emotional fortitude. Though she had long since left those streets behind, her instincts remained sharp. A single mother juggling work and responsibilities, Elaine had endured much, but she had always emerged stronger, if slightly scarred. Now, more than ever, she cherished moments like these, where the only battles were Lena's playful struggles to balance on her skateboard. Yet, Elaine could never completely silence the voice in her head that urged caution. Years of navigating prejudice and microaggressions had left her wary of the world's harsher realities. Tonight, however, she chose to ignore the unease that occasionally flickered in the corners of her mind. She focused instead on Lena, whose determination was shining brighter with every small triumph. "Look at me, Mom," Lena squealed, managing a few seconds of steady balance before the skateboard wobbled and tipped her off. She tumbled into the grass with a giggle, Elaine quickly scooping her up with an encouraging laugh. "That's my girl," Elaine said, her smile radiating pride. "Next time, you'll stay up even longer." A few yards away, however, an unwelcome presence loomed. Officer Darren Crowley, a middle-aged white policeman, sauntered into view. His sharp gaze swept the park, but when it landed on Elaine and Lena, it lingered. Crowley was notorious in the area, not for heroism or dedication, but for his abrasive demeanor and deep-seated prejudices. His decades on the force had hardened him, and his unchecked frustrations often spilled over into hostility toward the black community. As he approached, Crowley's steps were deliberate, each crunch of gravel announcing his arrival. Elaine caught sight of him from the corner of her eye, her body tensing imperceptibly. She had seen men like him before, men who carried their bias like a weapon, ready to wield it without provocation. Her instincts urged her to gather Lena and leave. but her pride and resolve held her in place. Elaine's heart beat faster as Crowley drew near, his uniform a grim reminder of the power he wielded. She didn't want to alarm Lena, who was oblivious to the growing tension. Still, Elaine adjusted her stance subtly, positioning herself protectively between the officer and her daughter. Crowley's voice broke through the stillness, loud and grating. "You don't belong here," he barked, the disdain in his tone impossible to miss. His eyes flicked dismissively between Elaine and Lena, his posture rigid with confrontation. Elaine's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm as she replied, "We're just enjoying the park, officer. It's public property, and we have every right to be here." Crowley took a step closer, invading her space with an aggressive sneer. "People like you always think you can do whatever you want," he spat. "This is a nice area. Families come here for peace, not for trouble." Elaine clenched her fists at her sides, the weight of his insinuation pressing heavily on her. Still, she refused to let him see her anger. Years of practice had taught her the power of restraint. She locked eyes with Crowley, her voice measured but firm. "We're not causing any trouble. My daughter is learning to skateboard, that's all." For a moment, Lena's laughter died as she turned her wide eyes toward Crowley. The hostility in his voice wasn't lost on her, and she instinctively moved closer to Elaine, clutching the edge of her mother's shirt. Elaine felt the small tug and steeled herself further. This wasn't just about her now. This was about showing Lena that fear didn't dictate their lives. As the seconds ticked by, Crowley's presence grew heavier, his condescension palpable. Elaine held her ground, refusing to cower, even as her mind raced. The peace of their evening was unraveling, and the storm brewing before them was only beginning to take shape. Elaine Harper stood firm, her protective instincts sharper than ever, as Officer Darren Crowley's confrontational stance deepened. He exuded an air of unchecked authority, his every word dripping with disdain. Lena, clutching her mother's shirt tightly, looked up with a mix of fear and confusion, her young mind trying to process the hostility directed at them. Bookmark. Crowley sneered, stepping even closer, his boots crunching loudly against the gravel path. "I've seen your kind before," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "Always pushing boundaries, thinking you're above the rules." Elaine's heart pounded, her pulse thrumming in her ears, but her face remained calm. Years of enduring prejudices had taught her how to mask her emotions, even when every fiber of her being burned with indignation. She straightened her shoulders, meeting Crowley's icy glare with unwavering resolve. "My kind?" she replied evenly, refusing to rise to his bait. "We're here like everyone else, officer. A mother and daughter enjoying the park. That's not against the law." Lena's small hand gripped Elaine's shirt even tighter, her tiny frame pressing into her mother's side. Elaine reached down, placing a reassuring hand on Lena's back. She could feel the tension radiating from her daughter, and it broke her heart to know Lena was witnessing such unwarranted hostility. Crowley chuckled, the sound harsh and mocking. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his tone sharp. "Teaching your kid to skate, or maybe teaching her how to break rules early, just like the rest of you?" Elaine's breath caught in her throat. The blatant stereotyping, the attempt to paint her and Lena as troublemakers, was more than just an insult. It was a calculated move to strip them of their humanity, to reduce them to the very prejudices Crowley harbored. But Elaine refused to crumble. She tightened her grip on Lena and took a step forward, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I'm teaching my daughter confidence, officer," she said, her words slow and deliberate, "teaching her that she belongs wherever she chooses to go, no matter what anyone says." Her defiance only seemed to fuel Crowley's anger. His eyes narrowed, and the sneer on his face deepened. "You've got a lot of nerve," he growled, leaning in close enough for Elaine to catch the faint scent of his aftershave. "Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson about respect." Elaine braced herself as Crowley's hand rose swiftly, and then the sharp crack of his palm meeting her cheek echoed through the park. The blow was hard, sending a jolt of pain through Elaine's face and forcing her back a step. The sting wasn't just physical. It carried with it the weight of humiliation, of every injustice she had ever endured. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Elaine's hand instinctively reached for her stinging cheek, her mind racing as she processed what had just happened. Around her, the park's calm atmosphere shattered. Lena gasped audibly, her small voice breaking through the stillness. "Mama!" Lena cried, her voice trembling with fear. She clutched her skateboard tightly, her wide eyes brimming with tears. Elaine turned to her daughter, the sight of Lena's fear snapping her back into focus. She placed her hands firmly on Lena's shoulders, her voice gentle despite the chaos swirling around them. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "I'm okay." But Elaine wasn't okay. The slap wasn't just an act of violence. It was a declaration of Crowley's belief in his unchecked power. And yet, in that moment, Elaine realized something profound. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Lena, about teaching her daughter that no one, not even a man in uniform, had the right to diminish their worth. Elaine straightened, the sting on her cheek now a badge of her resolve. Her gaze met Crowley's, and something in her eyes made him falter, if only for a moment. She stepped forward, her voice low but filled with steely determination. "You will not lay another hand on me," she said, her tone unwavering. "Not here, not anywhere, and certainly not in front of my daughter." Crowley blinked, clearly unaccustomed to such defiance. Most people, Elaine imagined, would have crumbled under his aggression, but she wasn't most people, and she refused to let him intimidate her. Lena, though still visibly shaken, seemed to draw strength from her mother's unwavering stance. The little girl stepped closer, her voice surprisingly strong for someone so young. "Leave my mom alone," she demanded, her small frame trembling but firm. Crowley's face twisted in anger. The defiance from both mother and daughter was too much for his bruised ego. He stepped forward aggressively, but this time a voice interrupted him. "Hey, what's going on here?" Elaine turned to see a man approaching from the distance. He was tall, with a salt-and-pepper beard and a commanding presence that seemed to fill the space around him. Though dressed in civilian clothes, there was an unmistakable air of authority about him. Crowley turned sharply, clearly irritated by the interruption. "This doesn't concern you," he barked, trying to regain control of the situation. The man didn't flinch. His eyes flicked to Elaine and Lena, softening slightly before hardening as they returned to Crowley. "It does when I see a woman and her child being harassed," he replied firmly. "And I suggest you step back, officer, before this gets worse for you." Crowley hesitated, his bravado faltering under the weight of the man's calm authority. Around them, passers-by had begun to stop and watch, their murmurs growing louder as the tension in the air thickened. Elaine felt a spark of hope. She didn't know who this man was, but his presence alone shifted the balance of power. She held Lena close, drawing strength from the protective arm wrapped around her daughter's shoulders. For the first time that evening, the weight of Crowley's dominance seemed to lift, replaced by the glimmer of something Elaine hadn't felt in years. Possibility. Elaine Harper held Lena close, the pounding of her heart echoing in her ears as the tension in the park escalated. Officer Darren Crowley stood rigid, his expression a mixture of irritation and disbelief. The stranger's interruption had shifted the dynamics, and the growing crowd of onlookers made it clear that his usual tactics wouldn't go unchecked this time. The man with the salt-and-pepper beard stood firm, his gaze steady as he addressed Crowley. "What I see here is abusive power," he said calmly but with a sharp edge. "This woman and her daughter have done nothing to warrant your aggression." Crowley bristled, his jaw tightening as his authority was challenged. "I suggest you mind your business," he snapped, his voice louder now, as if volume alone could reassert his dominance. "This is a police matter." The man didn't budge. "A police matter?" he asked, his tone calm but cutting. "Because it looks to me like you assaulted this woman without provocation. I'm sure the other people here would agree." At that, several voices from the gathering crowd murmured their agreement. Some held up their phones, capturing the scene on video. The sight of those raised phones seemed to unnerve Crowley for the first time. He glanced around, his eyes narrowing as he realized the unfolding situation was no longer under his control. Elaine's resolve only deepened. She wasn't alone anymore, and the presence of witnesses gave her strength. She took a small step forward, her voice measured but firm. "You hit me in front of my daughter," she said, her words directed at Crowley. "You abused your authority, and now you're trying to intimidate us." Lena clung to her mother's side, her small hands gripping Elaine's shirt tightly. The little girl's wide eyes were fixed on Crowley, her fear gradually being replaced by a flicker of courage drawn from her mother's example. Crowley's lip curled in frustration. "You're twisting this," he barked, pointing a finger at Elaine. "You were acting suspicious." "I was doing my job." "Suspicious?" Elaine echoed, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "Walking in the park with my daughter is suspicious now?" The man with the beard stepped closer, his presence a protective shield between Elaine and Crowley. "Your job," he said, his voice hardening, "is to serve and protect, not to intimidate and assault innocent people." Crowley's eyes darted to the growing crowd, and his irritation boiled over. "Fine," he spat. "I'll let it slide this time. But don't think for a second that I'm done here." Elaine's sharp gaze followed Crowley as he stepped back, but her instincts told her this wasn't over. Men like him didn't walk away quietly, not when their authority had been challenged. Still, for the moment, she felt a measure of relief as he turned and began to walk off, muttering under his breath. The bearded man turned to Elaine, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Elaine nodded, though her cheek still stung from Crowley's slap. "I'm fine," she replied. "Thank you for stepping in." The man extended a hand. "I'm Martin Caldwell," he introduced himself. "I'm a civil rights attorney. I couldn't stand by and watch that happen." Elaine shook his hand, her grip firm. "Elaine Harper," she said. "This is my daughter, Lena." Lena looked up at Martin with wide eyes, her fear slowly giving way to curiosity. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Martin crouched slightly, his gaze level with Lena's. "You're very brave," he told her with a warm smile. "You stayed by your mom's side, and that takes a lot of courage." Lena's lips curved into a small smile, the tension in her posture easing as she leaned into Elaine. Just as the situation seemed to settle, Crowley's voice rang out again from the edge of the crowd. Elaine turned sharply, her stomach twisting in dread as she saw him approaching once more. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 other uniformed officers flanked him, their postures mirroring Crowley's aggression. "Really?" Martin muttered under his breath, straightening as he positioned himself between Elaine and the advancing officers. Crowley's sneer was back, his confidence apparently bolstered by his reinforcements. "I got a report about a disturbance in the park," he announced, his tone dripping with false authority. "This woman assaulted an officer." Elaine's eyes widened in disbelief. "Assaulted?" she echoed, her voice rising slightly. "You hit me." "That's not how I remember it," Crowley said smugly, his words meant to provoke. Martin stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "Officer Crowley," he began, "you're on thin ice already. I have no doubt these videos," he gestured to the onlookers with their phones, "will show exactly who assaulted whom." One of the other officers, a younger man with a hesitant expression, glanced at the crowd nervously. "Maybe we should back off," he muttered to Crowley, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. But Crowley glared at him, his pride refusing to let him retreat. "Stay out of this," he snapped before turning his attention back to Elaine. "You're coming with us." Elaine stepped back, pulling Lena behind her protectively. "You have no right to take me anywhere," she said firmly. "I haven't done anything wrong." Martin raised a hand, signaling for calm. "Officer Crowley," he said, his voice steady, "if you attempt to arrest this woman without cause, I will make sure this entire situation becomes a legal nightmare for you. And judging by the crowd, you won't have many supporters." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, their discontent palpable. "We saw what you did," a woman shouted from the back. "Leave her alone." Crowley's jaw clenched, his frustration mounting. He looked around, realizing the tide was turning against him. Still, he wasn't ready to concede. His hand hovered near his radio, but before he could call for more backup, the younger officer stepped forward, placing a hesitant hand on his arm. "Enough," the younger officer said, his voice quiet but firm. "This is getting out of hand." Crowley glared at him, his pride visibly warring with his better judgment. For a long, tense moment, he seemed poised to escalate further. But as more voices from the crowd began to rise in protest, his shoulders finally slumped. "This isn't over," he growled, turning on his heel and stalking away. The other officers hesitated before following him, their expressions uncertain. As the tension ebbed, the crowd erupted into applause and cheers. Elaine felt Lena's small arms wrap around her waist, and she hugged her daughter tightly, her heart swelling with both relief and gratitude. Martin turned to Elaine, a faint smile on his lips. "You handled that with more grace than most people would," he said. Elaine nodded, her resolve hardening. "This isn't over," she echoed Crowley's words, but her tone carried a far different meaning. "He won't get away with this." The cool night air seemed heavier now, weighed down by the tension that lingered, even as Officer Darren Crowley retreated into the shadows with his fellow officers. Elaine Harper stood still, her arms wrapped protectively around Lena, who clung tightly to her waist. The cheers of the crowd around them felt distant, like a muffled echo, as Elaine's mind raced. She couldn't shake the image of Crowley's sneer or the feel of his hand striking her face. The humiliation and rage simmered under her calm exterior, but her resolve had only hardened. Men like him relied on fear to dominate, to suppress, but Elaine wasn't about to let him or anyone else rob her of her dignity. Bookmark. Lena's small voice broke through Elaine's thoughts. "Mom, is he coming back?" Elaine looked down at her daughter, her heart breaking at the uncertainty and fear etched across Lena's face. "No, baby," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Lena's cheek. "Not tonight." Martin Caldwell, the civil rights attorney who had intervened, stepped closer, his gaze steady as he surveyed the dispersing crowd. "You handled yourself well back there," he said. Elaine gave a small nod. "I didn't feel like I had a choice," she admitted. "He hit me in front of my daughter. I couldn't just let him get away with that." Martin's expression darkened, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "He won't," he assured her. "I've seen men like Crowley before. They think they're untouchable, but they're not. We'll make sure he answers for this." Elaine appreciated his confidence, but she knew the reality of the uphill battle ahead. Men like Crowley rarely faced consequences for their actions, shielded by a system that often protected its own. She sighed, glancing down at Lena, who hadn't let go of her hand. "Thank you," Elaine said to Martin, her voice steady. "But I need to get my daughter home." "Of course," Martin replied, his tone understanding. "Here's my card." He handed her a small, neatly printed card with his contact information. "Call me if anything happens or if you decide you want to take this further. You don't have to fight this alone." Elaine took the card, slipping it into her pocket. "I'll think about it," she said, though in her heart she already knew she wasn't done fighting. The walk home was quiet, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound between them. Lena held Elaine's hand tightly, her small skateboard tucked under her arm like a shield. When they reached their small apartment, Elaine locked the door behind them and exhaled deeply, the tension in her chest easing slightly. She knelt to Lena's level, gently placing her hands on her daughter's shoulders. "Are you okay?" Elaine asked, her voice tender. Lena nodded, but her eyes were wide with emotion. "You weren't scared of him," she said, her tone filled with awe. "Even when he hit you, you didn't let him push us around." Elaine's chest tightened, her emotions swirling between pride and heartbreak. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "sometimes we have to stand up, even when it's scary. No one has the right to treat us like we're less than them." Lena nodded again, her lips pressed together in determination. "I'm glad you stood up to him, Mom," she said. Elaine pulled her daughter into a tight hug, holding her close as the weight of the evening settled over her. She felt Lena's small hands clutch the back of her shirt, her daughter's steady presence grounding her. But as Elaine held Lena, a sudden knock at the door sent a jolt of alarm through her. She froze, her instincts screaming caution. Slowly, she stood, her hand resting protectively on Lena's shoulder. "Stay here," Elaine whispered, her tone firm but calm. Lena nodded, retreating into the living room as Elaine moved toward the door. Her heart pounded as she peered through the peephole. To her relief, it wasn't Crowley. It was Martin Caldwell. Elaine opened the door cautiously, her brow furrowing. "Martin?" "Sorry to drop by unannounced," Martin said, his tone apologetic but urgent. "I wanted to make sure you were okay and to warn you. I've dealt with men like Crowley before. He won't take what happened lightly." Elaine's stomach sank, but she masked her unease. "What do you mean?" Martin's expression was grim. "He might retaliate, show up at your work, try to make things difficult for you. These guys hate losing control." Elaine clenched her jaw, her resolve solidifying further. "Let him try," she said. "I'm not backing down." Martin nodded, his respect for her evident. That's exactly the attitude you need, he said. But you don't have to do it alone. I meant what I said earlier. If you want to pursue legal action, I'll be with you every step of the way. Elaine hesitated, glancing toward the living room where Lena was sitting quietly. She knew the risks of going against someone like Crowley, but she also knew she couldn't let this slide, not after what had happened in front of her daughter. All right, Elaine said finally. Let's do it. The next morning, Elaine woke early, her cheeks still tender from Crowley's slap. She stared at herself in the bathroom mirror, the faint redness on her skin a stark reminder of the previous night's events. But it wasn't just the physical pain that lingered. It was the humiliation, the audacity of Crowley's actions, and the memory of Lena's terrified expression. Elaine stepped into the kitchen, where Lena was quietly coloring at the table. She kissed the top of her daughter's head, drawing comfort from her presence. We're going to be okay, Elaine said, more to herself than Lena. As the day unfolded, Elaine couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At the store where she worked, she noticed a patrol car parked across the street, its occupants occasionally glancing in her direction. That evening, as she locked up the store, she heard footsteps behind her. Her pulse quickened, her body tensing as she turned to face the source of the sound. It was Crowley. He stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, his smirk cold and menacing. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? He sneered. This isn't over, Harper, not by a long shot. Elaine met his gaze, her fear transforming into anger. You don't scare me, Crowley, she said firmly. You might think you're untouchable, but you're not. Crowley's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of anger. He stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. We'll see about that. Elaine held her ground, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. She wasn't about to let him intimidate her. Not now. Not ever. Elaine Harper walked home that evening with her shoulders squared, but her mind was racing. Crowley's threat lingered like a dark cloud over her thoughts. He had made it clear that this wasn't over, but Elaine wasn't the same woman she had been before his slap. Something had shifted. She wasn't just a victim of his abuse, she was now a mother on a mission, determined to protect her daughter and stand up for herself. Bookmark. Go back, Lena greeted her with a smile as Elaine stepped into their apartment, her daughter's small presence grounding her in the moment. Elaine returned the smile, setting down her bag and pulling Lena into a hug. Did you have a good day, sweetheart? Elaine asked, smoothing a hand over Lena's braids. Lena nodded. I drew a picture of us, she said, holding up her drawing. It was a crude but heartfelt sketch of Elaine and Lena in the park, their hands clasped as the sun shone above them. Elaine's throat tightened as she took in the drawing. It was a reminder of why she couldn't let Crowley's actions go unchecked. It's beautiful, she said softly, pulling Lena close. The next day, Elaine met with Martin Caldwell at a small coffee shop not far from her apartment. She was nervous but resolute. Martin had already started laying the groundwork for their case, gathering evidence and reaching out to witnesses from the park. I've spoken to a few people who were there that night, Martin began, flipping through a small notebook. Several of them recorded what happened, and they're willing to come forward if this goes to court. Elaine felt a flicker of hope. And the video evidence? She asked. Martin nodded. It's damning, he said. It clearly shows Crowley striking you without provocation. That's assault, plain and simple. Elaine exhaled slowly, the weight of the previous days pressing against her chest. What about Lena? She asked hesitantly. I don't want her dragged into this more than she already has been. Martin's expression softened. We'll do everything we can to protect her, he assured her. But Elaine, I won't lie to you. Crowley's going to fight back, and he's going to use every resource he has to discredit you. Elaine nodded, her jaw tightening. I'm ready, she said. I don't care what he throws at me. I can't let him get away with this. Martin leaned back in his chair, studying her. You're stronger than most people I've worked with, he said. That strength is going to carry you through this. Elaine wasn't sure if she believed him, but she appreciated the reassurance. She had spent her entire life enduring and overcoming challenges. This was just another battle, albeit a much larger one. The article came out 3 days later. Titled Abusive Power, When Those Meant to Protect Become the Threat, it detailed Elaine's encounter with Crowley, alongside testimonies from other victims who had faced similar mistreatment. The journalist, a seasoned writer known for tackling issues of injustice, had painted a stark picture of the systemic abuse that Crowley represented. Elaine's story went viral within hours. Social media erupted with outrage, the hashtag Justice for Elaine trending nationally. Comments poured in, ranging from messages of support to calls for Crowley's immediate suspension. Elaine scrolled through her phone that evening, her emotions a mix of gratitude and apprehension. "Look, Mom," Lena said, pointing at a video of the park encounter that had gained thousands of views. "People are saying you're brave." Elaine smiled faintly, though the weight of the attention pressed heavily on her shoulders. "It's not just about being brave, Lena," she said gently. "It's about doing what's right." Lena nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "You always do what's right," she said confidently. Elaine hugged her daughter, drawing strength from Lena's unwavering faith in her. But as the public rallied behind Elaine, so too did the resistance from Crowley's supporters. A few days after the article was published, Elaine found a police car parked outside her apartment building. The officers inside made no attempt to hide their presence, their stares cold and unyielding as Elaine left to take Lena to school. At work, the same pattern emerged. Uniformed officers would occasionally walk by the store where Elaine worked, their glances through the window heavy with silent intimidation. The message was clear. They were watching her. That evening, Elaine received a text from an unknown number. "You think this is over? You've made a mistake." Her blood ran cold as she read the message. She deleted it immediately, not wanting Lena to see, but the threat lingered in her mind. When Martin called later that night, his tone was serious. "Elaine, I just got a tip from someone inside the department," he said. "They're trying to dig up dirt on you. Old records, minor infractions, anything they can use to discredit you." Elaine's anger flared. "Of course they are," she said bitterly. "That's what men like Crowley do. They twist the narrative to protect themselves." Martin's voice softened. "We're ready for this, Elaine. You've been transparent with me from the start, and we'll make sure they can't use anything against you. But I need you to stay strong." Elaine nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm not backing down, Martin," she said firmly. "They can try whatever they want. I'm not letting them scare me off." The next morning, Elaine was leaving for work when her neighbor, Mrs. Garrett, stopped her in the hallway. "I saw that article," the elderly woman said, her eyes brimming with concern. "I had no idea you went through all that." Elaine offered a small smile. "It's been a lot, but I'm okay," she said. Mrs. Garrett placed a hand on Elaine's arm. "You're not just okay. You're inspiring," she said. "If you need anything, you let me know." Elaine felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you," she said softly. The small gestures of support from her community bolstered her spirit, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this fight. For every threat or intimidation tactic, there were people like Mrs. Garrett who stood behind her. That evening, as Elaine tucked Lena into bed, she thought about the days ahead. The road would be long, and the fight against Crowley would take more than just courage. It would take resilience, patience, and an unwavering belief in justice. But as she kissed Lena's forehead and whispered goodnight, Elaine knew she was ready. She had faced men like Crowley before. This time, however, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Lena, for her community, and for everyone who had ever been silenced. Elaine Harper sat in her small living room, the shadows of the evening stretching long across the walls. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the coffee table, but she ignored it. The past week had been a whirlwind of escalating tension, and her energy was wearing thin. Messages of support flooded her inbox alongside subtle threats designed to rattle her. Yet through it all, Elaine held fast to one thought. She couldn't let fear dictate her actions. Bookmark, go back. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Elaine hesitated for a moment, her instincts warning her to be cautious. After peeking through the peephole, she opened the door to find Martin Caldwell standing there, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "Elaine," he greeted, stepping inside as she waved him in. "I came by to talk. There's been a development." She closed the door and gestured for him to sit. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flicker of apprehension in her chest. Martin placed a file on the table, his fingers drumming lightly against its cover. "We've gathered more testimonies," he said. "Witnesses from the park, along with others who've had encounters with Crowley. Their stories align with patterns of harassment, intimidation, and even physical aggression. It paints a damning picture. Elaine nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. That's good, right? It strengthens the case? It does, Martin affirmed. But Crowley isn't sitting idle. He started leaking misinformation, trying to frame you as a troublemaker. They've even hinted at revisiting some minor incidents from your past. Elaine's jaw tightened. So they're trying to discredit me. Exactly, Martin said. But don't worry. We've anticipated this. Your record is clean where it matters, and their attempts to smear you only make them look desperate. Elaine leaned back against the couch, her mind racing. She had expected resistance, but hearing how far Crowley was willing to go still stung. What's the next step, she asked. We're filing formal charges against Crowley, Martin said firmly. Assault, abuse of power, and harassment. It's time to take this to the next level. The next morning, Elaine awoke to find a patrol car parked conspicuously outside her apartment. 2 officers sat inside, their gazes fixed on her window. She felt a cold knot of unease form in her stomach, but she refused to let them see her fear. Instead, she calmly walked Lena to school, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. Mama, Lena whispered as they neared the school gates. Why are those policemen watching us? Elaine knelt to Lena's level, brushing a hand over her daughter's cheek. They're just trying to make us feel scared, she explained gently. But we're not going to let them, right? Lena nodded slowly, her small hand tightening around Elaine's. Right, she said with quiet determination. Elaine kissed Lena's forehead and watched her walk into the school before turning back toward home. She noticed the patrol car was gone, but the tension lingered like a shadow. Later that day, Elaine met Martin at his office, where he introduced her to a journalist from a respected investigative news outlet. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen Foster, had been following the case closely and was eager to help bring Crowley's history to light. Elaine, Karen began, setting up her recorder, your story has already sparked national attention. But we want to go deeper. People need to know this isn't an isolated incident. They need to understand the systemic issues that enable men like Crowley. Elaine hesitated for a moment, glancing at Martin for reassurance. He nodded encouragingly, and she took a deep breath before speaking. I'll do it, Elaine said. But this isn't just about me. It's about my daughter, about everyone who's been hurt by people abusing their power. I need the world to know the truth. For the next hour, Elaine recounted her experiences in vivid detail, from the night at the park to the relentless intimidation that followed. She spoke about her fears, her anger, and her resolve to fight back, not just for herself, but for Lena and her community. Karen listened intently, her pen moving rapidly across her notebook as she scribbled notes. When the interview concluded, Karen offered Elaine a firm handshake. Thank you for your courage, she said. This story is going to make waves. The article was published a few days later, titled A Mother's Fight for Justice, Exposing a System of Abuse. It combined Elaine's story with the testimonies of others who had encountered Crowley, painting a stark and undeniable picture of his misconduct. Social media erupted again, the hashtag #JusticeForElaine gaining even more traction as the public demanded accountability. Crowley, however, wasn't backing down. That same night, Elaine received another anonymous text. You think you've won? This isn't over. Elaine stared at the message, her hands trembling slightly. She deleted it, refusing to give it power, but the unease it brought stayed with her. She spent the evening checking the locks on her doors and windows, her senses heightened with anxiety. The next morning, she noticed a familiar figure lingering near her workplace. Crowley himself. He leaned casually against a street lamp, his arms crossed as he watched her through the store's window. Elaine's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to appear unfazed as she continued her shift. That evening, as Elaine closed up the store, she heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps behind her. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Crowley approaching, his expression cold and smug. You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? He sneered. Stirring up trouble, dragging my name through the mud. Do you really think you're going to win? Elaine squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze head-on. This isn't about winning, Crowley, she said firmly. It's about doing what's right. Crowley stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You think you're untouchable now, don't you? Because you've got a lawyer and some people on your side? Let me tell you something, Harper. People like me, we don't lose. Elaine's heart pounded, but she refused to show her fear. You've already lost, she said, her voice steady. Every time you try to intimidate me, you prove exactly why you don't deserve that badge. Crowley's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of anger. He took another step forward, his presence looming, but Elaine didn't flinch. Stay away from me, she said, her tone icy. Stay away from my daughter. If you come near us again, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are. Crowley's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He turned sharply and walked away. His retreating figure, a stark reminder that Elaine's battle was far from over. Elaine Harper woke the next morning with a heavy sense of unease, a feeling that had taken root deep within her after the confrontation with Officer Darren Crowley the previous evening. His words echoed in her mind. People like me, we don't lose. The threat wasn't just about intimidation. It was a declaration of war, one she knew wouldn't end without more conflict. As she prepared breakfast for Lena, she tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the simple routines that brought her peace. But when she glanced out the kitchen window, her stomach dropped. A patrol car was parked across the street again, the officers inside watching her apartment intently. Elaine tightened her grip on the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. She could feel their presence like a physical weight, pressing down on her with silent hostility. Mama, Lena called softly from the table, where she was finishing her cereal. Are those police there because of us? Elaine turned to her daughter, her heart aching at the worry in Lena's voice. They're just doing their job, sweetheart, she said, forcing a reassuring smile. Don't worry about them. But Elaine couldn't shake her own worry. She kissed Lena's forehead and saw her off to school, watching her walk into the building before heading back home. By the time Elaine reached her workplace, the patrol car had followed her. It parked across the street again, and this time one of the officers got out, lingering near the store's entrance. Elaine felt her chest tighten, but she refused to let them see her fear. As she worked through her shift, customers occasionally glanced nervously toward the officer outside. Elaine did her best to stay focused, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Just before closing, her phone buzzed with a text from Martin Caldwell. Call me when you're free. There's been another development. Elaine quickly finished up her tasks and locked the store for the night. She called Martin as she began her walk home, her footsteps echoing in the quiet evening air. What's going on? Elaine asked when he picked up. Martin's tone was serious. Crowley's allies in the department are doubling down, he said. They're trying to paint you as the aggressor. I've received word they're digging into your past, looking for anything they can twist to make you seem less credible. Elaine clenched her jaw. Let them dig, she said, her voice sharp. I've got nothing to hide. I know, Martin said, but we need to stay ahead of them. They're desperate, Elaine, and desperate people can be dangerous. As she neared her apartment building, Elaine caught sight of a figure leaning casually against a street lamp near her door. Her pulse quickened as she realized it was Crowley. He straightened as she approached, his smirk cold and calculated. Evening, Harper, he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. Elaine stopped several feet away, her posture rigid. What do you want, Crowley? She asked, her tone steady despite the fear simmering beneath her calm exterior. Crowley took a step closer, his hands stuffed into his pockets. I'm just here to remind you who you're dealing with, he said. You might think you've got the upper hand now, but trust me, that won't last. People like me always come out on top. Elaine held her ground, refusing to let him intimidate her. People like you? She repeated, her voice sharp. Bullies who think they can use their badge as a shield? Your time is running out, Crowley. His smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly masked it with another sneer. We'll see about that, he said before turning and walking away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Elaine waited until he was gone before unlocking her door and stepping inside. She leaned against the door for a moment, exhaling shakily as the weight of the encounter settled over her. The next day, Elaine's fears were confirmed. Martin called with more troubling news. They've issued a summons, he said. Crowley's claiming you assaulted him during the incident at the park. Elaine felt a wave of anger rise within her. "That's a lie," she said. "He hit me. Everyone saw it." "I know," Martin said, "but they're trying to use the system against you. It's a common tactic. Twist the truth, force you onto the defensive, and hope you crack under the pressure." Elaine clenched her fists. "I'm not cracking," she said firmly. "Not now. Not ever." "Good," Martin replied. "Because we're filing charges too officially. Assault, abusive power, harassment. We're taking this fight to them." A week later, Elaine found herself standing outside the courthouse, Lena's hand tightly clasped in her own. The support she had received in recent days had been overwhelming. Dozens of community members had shown up to stand with her, their presence a reminder that she wasn't fighting alone. Martin stood beside her, his expression calm but focused. "You ready for this?" he asked. Elaine nodded, her resolve unshaken. "I've never been more ready." Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Crowley sat across the room, flanked by his legal team. His usual arrogance was tempered by unease, but his eyes still held a glint of defiance. Elaine took her seat, Lena staying with a trusted neighbor in the gallery. Martin leaned over and whispered, "Remember, you're not just standing up for yourself. You're standing up for everyone who's been silenced by men like him." Elaine nodded, her heart pounding as the proceedings began. During the hearing, Elaine felt the weight of every gaze in the room as she recounted her experience. She spoke clearly and confidently, her words painting a vivid picture of the night in the park. The defense tried to twist her story, but Martin was ready. He dismantled their arguments with precision, presenting witness testimonies and video evidence that left little doubt about Crowley's actions. The turning point came when a former colleague of Crowley's took the stand, reluctantly admitting to witnessing patterns of misconduct over the years. His testimony was a damning blow to Crowley's defense, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted noticeably. By the end of the day, Elaine felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was finally being heard, and for the first time, it seemed like justice was within reach. As she left the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, Elaine felt Lena slip her hand into hers. "You were amazing, Mama," Lena said, her voice filled with pride. Elaine smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand. "We're not done yet, baby," she said softly, "but we're getting there." The morning air was crisp as Elaine Harper returned to the courthouse for the second day of proceedings. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she kept her head high, drawing strength from the faces of supporters who had gathered outside, holding signs of solidarity. Each word of encouragement whispered to her on her way inside felt like a balm for the unease that still lingered from the weeks of intimidation. Martin Caldwell greeted her at the courthouse steps, his usual air of calm determination reassuring. "Today's critical," he said. "The defense will throw everything they have at you, but we're prepared. Just stay steady and trust the evidence will speak for itself." Elaine nodded, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. "I've come too far to let them rattle me now," she said, her voice firm despite the butterflies in her stomach. Inside the courtroom, Officer Darren Crowley sat rigidly at the defense table, flanked by his attorneys. His expression was unreadable, but Elaine caught the faint tension in his posture. His bravado, while present, was beginning to crack under the mounting pressure of evidence and testimony. The morning began with witness after witness taking the stand. One by one, parkgoers who had been present on the night of the incident recounted what they had seen. "I was walking my dog when I saw him approach her," said one woman, her voice trembling slightly, the way he talked to her. "It was aggressive from the start, and then he hit her. There was no reason for it." Another witness, a man who had been jogging nearby, provided even more damning testimony. "He was yelling at her, trying to intimidate her," the man said. "She stayed calm, but you could tell he was looking for a reason to escalate things. And when she didn't give him one, he slapped her anyway." Elaine listened intently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Each word felt like a vindication, a reminder that she hadn't imagined the hostility of that night. When Martin called his star witness to the stand, the room fell silent. A former colleague of Crowley's, Officer Brian Keenan, hesitated for a moment before taking his seat. His reluctance was clear, but so was his desire to tell the truth. "I worked alongside Crowley for several years," Keenan began, his voice low but steady. "And I saw things, patterns of behavior that were troubling. He often targeted people of color, especially in wealthier neighborhoods. He'd escalate situations unnecessarily, provoke people until they reacted, and then use that as an excuse to assert force. Crowley's attorneys objected, claiming the testimony was irrelevant, but the judge allowed it to proceed. Keenan took a deep breath and continued. I stayed quiet for too long, and that's on me. But seeing what happened to Miss Harper, it was a breaking point. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. Elaine felt her chest tighten as she watched Keenan step down. His words were like a crack in the armor of silence that had protected Crowley for so long. As the day progressed, Martin presented video footage taken by bystanders in the park. The grainy clips clearly showed Crowley approaching Elaine and Lena, his body language aggressive. The slap was unmistakable, a harsh, unprovoked act that silenced any doubts about what had occurred. Crowley's defense team tried to argue that the footage didn't show the full context, but Martin was ready. The full context, he said, addressing the jury, is that an officer of the law abused his authority to intimidate a mother and her child. The footage doesn't obscure the truth. It reveals it. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as the footage played. Elaine glanced at the jury, noting the furrowed brows and somber expressions. They were seeing what she had experienced firsthand, and the truth was undeniable. During a brief recess, Elaine stepped outside for air, her thoughts swirling. Martin joined her, his expression thoughtful. They're losing ground, he said. It's written all over their faces. Crowley's team knows the evidence is stacked against them. Elaine nodded, taking a deep breath. I just want this to be over, she admitted. It will be, Martin assured her. And when it is, it'll be a victory not just for you, but for everyone who's faced what you have. The final testimony of the day came from Elaine herself. She walked to the stand with her head held high, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. As she raised her right hand to take the oath, she silently prayed for the strength to tell her story one more time. Miss Harper, Martin began, his voice steady and warm. Can you describe the events of that evening in your own words? Elaine took a deep breath, glancing briefly at Lena, who sat with a neighbor in the gallery. Her daughter's wide, hopeful eyes gave her the courage she needed. We were at the park, Elaine began, her voice calm but resolute. It was a rare evening for us, a chance to spend time together without the stress of work or responsibilities. I was teaching my daughter how to skateboard. She recounted every detail, from Crowley's initial approach to the way he struck her. Her voice only wavered once when she spoke about Lena's fear. My daughter saw everything, she said, her tone thick with emotion. She saw a man in a position of power try to humiliate her mother. But I couldn't let that be the lesson she learned about the world, that we have to accept being treated as less than human. The courtroom was silent as Elaine finished her testimony, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. She returned to her seat beside Martin, her hands trembling slightly, but her heart steady. As the day ended and the court adjourned, Elaine stepped outside to a crowd that had grown larger than ever. People cheered as she emerged, their voices a chorus of support. Elaine felt tears prick in her eyes as she looked around at the faces of strangers who had rallied behind her. Lena ran up to her, throwing her arms around her waist. You were amazing, Mama, she said, her voice filled with pride. Elaine knelt and hugged her daughter tightly. This isn't just my fight, baby, she whispered. It's for everyone who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. As they left the courthouse, Elaine felt a renewed sense of strength. The truth had been laid bare, and the fight for justice was nearing its conclusion. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Elaine Harper sat at the plaintiff's table beside Martin Caldwell, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. Her heart raced as she tried to read the expressions of the 12 jurors who held her fate and the fight for justice in their hands. Behind her, the gallery was packed with supporters, friends, and community members who had followed her story closely. Elaine felt their collective presence like a warm wave of solidarity, but the weight of the moment was hers alone to bear. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the judge began, addressing the somber group. Have you reached a verdict? A middle-aged man, the jury foreman, rose from his seat, holding a piece of paper in his slightly trembling hands. We have, Your Honor, he said. Elaine's breath hitched as the judge nodded. Please read the verdict. The foreman cleared his throat. In the case of Harper versus Crowley, on the count of assault, we find the defendant, Darren Crowley, guilty. The single word echoed in the courtroom, reverberating through Elaine's chest like a thunderclap. The tension that had gripped the room broke as murmurs rippled through the gallery, some people gasping, others exhaling in relief. Elaine blinked, hardly daring to believe what she had just heard. She turned to Martin, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. "You did it," he whispered, his voice low but filled with pride. "Order in the court," the judge said, tapping her gavel lightly as the murmurs grew louder. The room quickly fell silent again, and the judge turned her attention to Crowley. "This court finds Officer Darren Crowley guilty of assault and abuse of power," the judge declared. "Sentencing will take place in a separate hearing." Crowley sat rigidly at the defense table, his face pale and his jaw tightly clenched. Gone was the smug arrogance that had marked his demeanor throughout the trial. He looked smaller now, stripped of the authority he had once wielded so carelessly. As the court adjourned, Elaine stood on shaky legs. Lena rushed forward from the gallery and threw her arms around her mother's waist. "Mama, we won!" she exclaimed, her voice full of uncontainable joy. Elaine knelt to hug her daughter tightly, tears spilling down her cheeks as she held her close. "We did it, baby," she whispered. "We stood up, and we won." Martin placed a hand on Elaine's shoulder, his smile warm but measured. "This is a victory," he said, "but it's only the beginning. Crowley's conviction is just one piece of a much larger puzzle." Elaine nodded, rising to her feet with Lena still clinging to her hand. She knew Martin was right. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had suffered under men like Crowley, their voices silenced by fear or systemic barriers. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, their cheers erupting as Elaine emerged with Lena by her side. The scene was overwhelming. A sea of faces, camera flashes, and signs reading slogans like "Justice for All" and "End Abuse of Power." Elaine paused at the top of the courthouse steps, feeling the collective energy of the crowd washing over her. For the first time in weeks, the anxiety and tension that had weighed her down seemed to lift. Lena tugged on her hand, her wide eyes taking in the sight of the crowd. "They're here for you, Mama," she said, her voice filled with awe. Elaine smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand. "They're here for all of us," she said softly. Martin stepped up beside her, gesturing toward the microphone stand that had been set up for her. "You don't have to speak," he said gently. "But if you're ready, they're listening." Elaine hesitated, her nerves fluttering at the thought of addressing the crowd. But as she looked out over the sea of faces, some strangers, some familiar, she realized this was her moment to stand not just for herself, but for everyone who had supported her along the way. Taking a deep breath, Elaine stepped forward to the microphone. The crowd quieted almost instantly, their collective gaze fixed on her. "I want to thank everyone who stood by me during this fight," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "This victory isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who has ever been made to feel powerless. Wand-ho has ever been silenced by fear or oppression." She paused, glancing down at Lena, whose bright, trusting eyes gave her the strength to continue. "This isn't the end of the fight," Elaine said firmly. "It's the beginning. People like Darren Crowley abuse their power because they think they'll never be held accountable. Today, we showed them that's not true, and we'll keep showing them every day until no one has to live in fear of the people sworn to protect them." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing down the courthouse steps. Elaine stepped back, overwhelmed but grateful. That evening, Elaine sat with Lena at their kitchen table, sharing a quiet meal. For the first time in weeks, the apartment felt peaceful, and the weight of uncertainty finally lifted. Lena looked up from her plate, her young face serious. "Mama, does this mean the bad man can't hurt us anymore?" Elaine reached across the table, taking her daughter's small hand in hers. "It means he can't hurt us anymore," she said softly. "And it means we helped make the world a little safer for everyone else, too." In the days that followed, Elaine's story continued to spread. She became a symbol of resilience and courage, her name synonymous with the fight for accountability and justice. Messages poured in from people across the country, some sharing their own stories of facing abuse, others simply thanking her for her bravery. But Elaine knew her work wasn't done. Crowley's conviction was a step forward, but the system that had enabled his actions remained intact. She began meeting with Martin and other community leaders, discussing ways to create lasting change. "We need more than convictions," Martin said during one of their meetings. "We need reform. Training, oversight, transparency, it all starts here." Elaine agreed. She didn't just want to fight for justice. She wanted to build a world where no one had to fight the same battle she had. As she tucked Lena into bed one night, Elaine felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in months. Her daughter snuggled under the blankets, her eyes drooping with sleep. "I'm proud of you, Mama," Lena murmured, her voice soft and drowsy. Elaine kissed her forehead, a smile spreading across her face. "I'm proud of us," she whispered. As she turned out the light and closed the door, Elaine felt something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Hope. The courtroom victory against Officer Darren Crowley rippled far beyond Elaine Harper's small apartment and neighborhood. Her courage and resilience inspired people from all walks of life, and she soon found herself inundated with messages from strangers. Many shared their own stories of injustice, their voices trembling with the same mix of anger and helplessness Elaine had once felt. But she also heard something else in their words. Hope. Sitting in her living room one quiet morning, Elaine stared at her phone, scrolling through an overwhelming number of emails and social media messages. There were thank yous, stories of solidarity, and a recurring theme. "You gave us the courage to speak out." Elaine set her phone down and turned to Martin Caldwell, who had become not just her attorney, but a trusted confidant. He sat across from her, reviewing a stack of papers related to Crowley's sentencing hearing. "Martin," Elaine began, her voice hesitant, "do you think we could do more with this? More than just holding Crowley accountable?" Martin looked up, his brow furrowed in thought. "What do you have in mind?" Elaine picked up one of the letters she'd received, holding it tightly. "There are so many people out there who don't have anyone to stand with them," she said. "People who've gone through what I did, or worse. I want to help them. I want to give them the tools they need to fight back." Martin's expression softened into a smile. "I think that's a brilliant idea," he said. "You have a platform now, Elaine. You've shown the world what one voice can do. Imagine what 100, 1,000 voices could accomplish together." Over the next few weeks, Elaine and Martin worked tirelessly to bring her vision to life. With the help of community leaders, local activists, and legal experts, they founded Voices Unbroken, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of abuse, harassment, and systemic injustice. The mission was clear: to provide legal assistance, emotional support, and a safe space for people to share their stories. Elaine envisioned a network of resources that could empower individuals to stand up for themselves and others, just as she had. On the organization's launch day, Elaine stood in front of a packed community center, her heart pounding as she addressed the crowd. Lena sat in the front row, her eyes shining with pride as she watched her mother take the stage. "Voices Unbroken exists because no one should ever feel silenced," Elaine said, her voice steady and full of conviction. "We all deserve dignity, respect, and the right to live without fear. This organization is a promise that we will stand together, support one another, and fight for justice." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a powerful affirmation of the work Elaine had started. As the months passed, Voices Unbroken grew rapidly. Donations poured in from across the country, volunteers signed up to offer their time, and a team of dedicated attorneys joined Martin to provide legal representation for victims. Elaine became a public figure, her story drawing attention to the systemic issues that had allowed Crowley to abuse his power for so long. She traveled to schools, community centers, and rallies, sharing her experiences and encouraging others to find their voice. However, for Elaine, the most rewarding moments came from the people she met through the organization. One afternoon, a young woman named Tasha walked into the Voices Unbroken office. Her hands trembled as she clutched a folder of documents, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "I don't know if I belong here," Tasha said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elaine approached her with a warm smile, gently guiding her to a seat. "You're exactly where you need to be," she said. Tasha opened up slowly, recounting her own experiences with harassment and discrimination. By the time she finished, tears streamed down her cheeks, but her voice was steadier than when she'd begun. "I thought no one would believe me," Tasha said. Elaine reached out and took her hand. "I believe you," she said, "and we're going to help you fight back." Meanwhile, Crowley's sentencing hearing loomed closer. The conviction had been a significant victory, but the battle for full accountability wasn't over. Elaine and Martin continued to push for systemic reforms within the police department, calling for transparency, mandatory training on implicit bias, and independent oversight of misconduct cases. Their efforts gained traction, sparking citywide conversations about justice and equality. Other survivors of police abuse came forward, their voices adding to the growing chorus demanding change. The day of Crowley's sentencing arrived with a quiet tension. Elaine sat in the courtroom once more, Lena by her side, and Martin just behind them. She listened as the judge delivered the sentence. Crowley would serve time for his crimes and face permanent dismissal from the force. Elaine felt a wave of relief wash over her as the sentence was announced. But more than relief, she felt resolve. The system that had protected men like Crowley was still intact, and her fight for justice was far from over. That evening, Elaine returned home to a stack of letters from people thanking her for her courage. One, from a man named Victor, stood out. "I was afraid to speak up when it happened to me," Victor wrote, "but watching you stand your ground gave me the strength to finally tell my story. Thank you for showing me that silence isn't the answer." Elaine folded the letter carefully, her eyes misting with emotion. She thought of Lena, of the world she wanted to build for her daughter, a world where courage was met with justice and injustice was met with accountability. Months later, on the first anniversary of the Voices Unbroken launch, Elaine stood in the organization's bustling new headquarters. The once small nonprofit had blossomed into a vibrant community hub, its walls lined with photos and messages from people who had been helped by the organization. Elaine took the stage to address a crowd of supporters, volunteers, and allies. Lena stood proudly at her side, holding her mother's hand. "This isn't just about fighting injustice," Elaine said, her voice strong and clear. "It's about creating a future where everyone's voice is heard and everyone's humanity is respected. Together, we've started something powerful, something unbreakable." The crowd rose to their feet, their applause a resounding echo of her words. As Elaine stepped down from the stage, Lena hugged her tightly. "You're amazing, Mama," she said. Elaine smiled, brushing a hand over Lena's hair. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're amazing." And as the evening wore on, the warmth of community and purpose filled Elaine's heart. She had started this journey to protect herself and her daughter, but it had grown into something much larger, a beacon of hope, a testament to resilience, and a promise of change that would echo far beyond her own story. Elaine Harper's story is one of immense courage, resilience, and the transformative power of standing up for justice. It's not just a tale about one mother defending her dignity in the face of injustice. It's a reflection of the deep systemic challenges faced by many. Elaine's journey reminds us that silence in the face of wrongdoing only perpetuates the problem, and that even one voice, when firm and unwavering, can ignite change. Through her actions, Elaine showed her daughter Lena, and all of us, that fear does not define us. Instead, it is the choices we make in those moments of fear that shape our character and inspire others. Her fight for accountability didn't just hold one man responsible. It lit a beacon of hope for others who had been silenced. This story is a powerful reminder of the importance of community and solidarity. Elaine's victory wasn't hers alone. It was shared by the many people who stood beside her, from Martin Caldwell to the witnesses, supporters, and even strangers who rallied to her cause. Justice is rarely achieved in isolation, and Elaine's journey emphasizes that change is possible when we come together to demand it. At its heart, this story leaves us with a simple but profound lesson. When we stand up for what is right, we not only transform our own lives, but also pave the way for a better, more just world for others. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Did it inspire you? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And don't stop there. Share your own stories. Have you faced moments where standing up for yourself or others made a difference? We want to know how you fought for justice, equality, or even small everyday acts of courage. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss meaningful stories like this one. Share your thoughts about Elaine's journey in the comments below. Together, let's continue the conversation and inspire each other to build a world where every voice matters.